So we're starting to record. Yay, awesome. All right, so welcome to Engineering 10A / the Environmental the Sustainability Lecture Series, or seminar. What's the class actually officially called? I forget. Welcome to SUSC 5 / Engineering 10A. So today is awesome because we have two guest speakers from an engineering consulting firm called ENGEO. One of them is an environmental engineer, that's Jeff right here, and the other is an environmental scientist, that's Robert. I was going to say Rod here. I'm like, no, that's Rod. Robert's right here. And I believe they have an excellent slide deck set for us and to talk a little bit about their work. I've also asked them to talk a little bit briefly about maybe their academic pathway, kind of their experiences in college, and how they got to where they are now. The presentation will be about 50 minutes, and I encourage you all to ask questions at any point during the presentation. It might facilitate sort of a back and forth dialogue as the slides go through. But do so by raising your hand and wait to get called on. And then we'll definitely have a Q&A period after. Does that sound good? Yeah? Woo! Yay, okay. Welcome, our guests.
Yes, I do. Okay. And first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. It's raining right before your spring break. It's Friday afternoon. There's college basketball going on. There's been a couple episodes already. Thank you for coming here. And I've been thank you. My name is Jeff Adams. My colleague Robert Beck. We work with ENGEO Incorporated. We're headquartered in San Ramon. We have an office in San Francisco. We have an office in Oakland. Several other in California. We also have offices and headquarters overseas in New Zealand. We have an office presence in Australia. We're always looking to expand. Our company, we primarily do anything associated with earth science, geotechnical work, construction support. We do water resources. Robert and I focus on environmental. When I say environmental, that means a lot of things to a lot of people. We focus on toxic site characterization, remediation, i.e. take a brownfield or a dirty site, clean it up so it can be restored to some type of good use. So that's what we're all about. And my presentation today is going to talk about kind of all the things that we do. First, I'm going to make the case for sustainability because this really ties into a lot of what we do. There's a little brief historic regulatory context about the work that we do. Talk about characterization and remediation of these toxic sites, how we do what we do. Talk a little bit about the old ways we used to do things and how this is evolving into a more sustainable approach. And then how do we measure that? Everyone talks about sustainability. Everybody talks about green. But how do we make sure that we're really doing what we say? It's really intended to be. Talk a little bit about a brief case study. And then open it up for questions and answers at the end. It just looks like we had a little pop-up here.
Yep, that's me. Sorry.
No worries.
All right, there we go.
Just want to make sure.
Yep.
Fantastic. All right. So the first thing we want to do is make the case for sustainability. Now, a bunch of disjointed pictures. And again, this is by no means any type of endorsement for any of these things. Bad, wrong comments from the 80s, cigarettes, or anything like that. But it was the summer of 1989. I was a junior in high school. You can see me over here. There's a very good reason for why I went into science and engineering as opposed to baseball. Just look at that guy. You would never want to get pictures around. I grew up in a place called Mundelein, Illinois, which is an exurb, a small little suburb about 40 miles north of Chicago. And I was hanging out at my friend Bridget's house one Saturday. We were watching the movie Dirty Dancing. Anybody ever seen Dirty Dancing? Okay, fantastic. Nobody puts baby in the car.
Showing our age.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, really showing my age because we were watching it on a fancy device called a VCR. And we were hanging out. We were watching the movie, and her Uncle Steve, Bridget's father was a carpenter. I think he's a carpenter or plumber or electrician, something in the trades. Her uncle, or uncle who was younger than her father, Uncle Steve, he came in. And we were just talking, making idle time as we're watching the movie, and he said, all right, well, I'm going to go now. So I'll see you later. Be back in a few hours. I turned to Bridget and said, hey, where's Uncle Steve going? He said, oh, he's going to Indiana. I said, well, what's he going to Indiana for? And that's a good 50 miles away from where we live. Oh, he's going to buy cigarettes. And I kind of stopped and thought, wait a minute, hold on a second. This doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, why would you do that? This is when it dawned on me, two things. Sometimes you can do things that are more harm than good. And number two, maybe me, the kid, is smarter than some of the adults that I know. And the reason why I bring it up, here's the map. Mundelein is upward.
Oh. Do you need a hand?
I'm just trying to figure out the laser pointer.
Oh, the top button.
Oh, fantastic. There it is. Yeah. Okay, here we go. The top button. Aha, there we go. Mundelein's up here.
Indiana, the state line is right here. And the reason why Indiana is key to the story is Indiana is one of those places where everything is a little bit cheaper. Taxes are lower on gasoline, they're lower on cigarettes. It's a place you go a couple days before the 4th of July because you get much better fireworks. You know, it's also the environmental companies take trash there because the regulations are a little bit more lax. But it becomes a place that you go, you know, the gambling is better because the losses are, you're allowed bigger losses. So Indiana is where you go to do all this stuff. So I did some calculations. I went back in time to see what this all meant. Did some calculations. At the time, you know, cigarettes were cheaper in Indiana, by about 40 cents a pack. You know, so a carton of cigarettes, presuming that Uncle Steve at least was going to go buy a carton of cigarettes, you know, it was about $76 in Illinois versus $60 in Indiana. But again, it was 114 miles for a carton of cigarettes. Fine. He drove a truck. I assumed it was a 1987 Dodge Ram that got about 17 miles to the gallon. And again, he was going to go on a Saturday night, but let's assume that there was free flow traffic through the city of Chicago, which would never happen. But let's just assume. This is the one that'll break everybody's heart in this room. Gas is about $1.12 in Illinois. It was about, or $1.20 in Illinois at the time, about $1.12 in Indiana. And so if you figured he spent about, for the mileage, he spent about $7.50 in gas. There's tolls. If you took the Chicago Skyway, that was more expensive at the time. That was a toll of like, oh my goodness, 90 cents. Who has that kind of money? If you bought a carton of cigarettes, you saved $3.69 on the trip, but he burned 3 hours in doing all of this. So then if you say that he could have had a minimum wage at the time, which was $3.35 an hour, which was surprising to me because I worked in the hay barns that summer for $2.50 an hour, so I've got my farmer who underpaid me all this year. And you were able to get 25 cents a mile for the wear and tear in your automobile. He came out way behind. Not to mention that he burned an entire Saturday going to Indiana. Now, Indiana's very, very nice, and it's probably a nice drive and everything, and you know, maybe he just wants some time in the car. But the whole point is, how do we account for this? Did he do more harm than good? Would it have been a little bit better to save his Saturday if he wanted to get a carton of cigarettes to go down to the gas station, spend a few dollars, save the gasoline and all that? And that really is kind of a crazy way of talking about sustainability. How do we define sustainability? There's many textbook ways, but in essence, it's don't do more harm than good and try to preserve everything for the future. When we talk about green, it's let's work within the constraints of the environment to protect the environment for future generations. So when we talk about the work that we do at ENGEO and others do, some of our competitors and our colleagues, it's about cleaning up toxic sites. And what does this all mean and why do we have to do this? To give a little bit of a context, the chemical industry really came about post-World War II. And the reason was that a lot of industrial might was dedicated to the war effort for World War II. The same equipment that helped make gunpowder and bombs and other explosives could be easily converted into refining of chemicals, be converted into making petrochemical products, pesticides. Same raw materials would come in, they would tweak things, and all of a sudden you had organochlorine pesticides, you had herbicides, you would have motor fuels, you would have plastics. So there was a general convergence of that. And as a result, you had a lot of petrochemicals, a lot of synthetics were replacing natural materials. Things used to be built out of metal and wood, and they were being built out of plastics. Farmer fields were getting greater yields than ever because they were using pesticides for crop loss. They were taking out weeds. Again, we could talk about the virtues of that, but nobody can doubt that the use of these chemicals increased substantially during this period of time. And the science of making advanced faster than the science of what does it all mean, what are the side effects. And as a result, we ended up with a fairly contaminated world. Many things I'm sure you've talked about in your classes. There were some studies that were done. There were books that came out, books like Silent Spring, The Limits of Growth. They got people really concerned about how the environment was being treated. The anecdote I like to use is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire in 1969, which should be a surprise to everybody except the people in Cleveland because the river caught on fire all the time. Those are important things to think about. And so people stopped and said, what's going on here? A number of pieces of state and federal legislation were passed, and then all of a sudden we stopped and we said, okay, great. Well, we'll stop future problems from arising to the best we can, but what do we do about the stuff that already exists? And that's really how the toxic site characterization remediation approach began. So when we find a site that we think is contaminated, we go out and we sample it. How do we do that? We go out, we grab soil samples. Literally, we go out and we sample the soil, either from the surface, or we drill borings and we take samples from deeper measured from the ground surface. Also, we can sample groundwater. When you envision groundwater, think of like a bucket of Home Depot bucket, 5-gallon bucket, fill it up with sand, and then pour some water. So some of it has water. That's kind of what we're looking at. It's not that you have an underground cavern of floating water. You just happen to have sand with water in between the particles. That water can be taken out and used for domestic purposes via a well. It also could be contaminated. We install wells to find out if groundwater is contaminated, and if so, what do we want to do about it? The typical ways we're installing these big wells and using these big soil borings that generate a lot of waste material, a lot of cuttings. What do you do with that? We got a little bit smarter as time went on. So we started going direct push. Much smaller, better equipment. We don't generate nearly the amount of waste. We get faster, quicker, better results. We started to do this. Not only that, but when chemicals get in the ground, they're volatile. Volatile means that they evaporate and you can actually smell them. They're aromatic, again, the aroma. Think of gasoline. Think of components to gasoline, like benzene or toluene or ethyl benzene. Those, when they evaporate, can migrate in the subsurface and they can enter into structures and pose a health risk, either an acute risk where a little bit of breathing can cause a problem, or long-term risk where lower concentrations can cause health risk over a period of time. We have ways to test this, where we can actually stick a probe into the ground, hook up a canister, draw that, using a vacuum, draw some of this out to find out if these contaminants are in place. And if they are, we can take a look and say, what can we do about these? And it becomes a matter of looking at the structure, how the structure is operated, what are the temperatures, what are the foundation conditions, what are the building conditions, and truly, is there a risk where contaminants in the subsurface can migrate up, volatilize, move through the subsurface, and enter into the structure. Now, if that's the case and we have an issue where there is a health risk or an environmental ecological risk, then we're compelled to do some type of remediation. Now, in the old days, we'll take a look at the remedial and implementation strategy of trying to figure out what's going on at the site. Here's an example where we have maybe an underground storage tank that leaked. Contamination may have migrated downwards, hit the groundwater table, took off a little bit. Groundwater tends to have a gradient, tends to flow. You can picture this if you're right near the bay. If there's a tide, the tide goes up, the tide goes down, groundwater will flow in and flow out. But that happens to some extent everywhere. There's a little flow, so you tend to get a little bit of a smear. So the idea is to characterize what's going on, what's where, and how do we mitigate it so it doesn't pose a risk to the environment or to human health going forward. And some of the things we used to do in the old days, and we still do it a lot to this day, but we're looking for other things, more on that in a minute, is kind of the brute force approach. If we have contaminated soil, what do? We can always dig it up and take it away. We do the excavation approach quite a bit. Very simple. Get a big scoop, dig up the contaminated soil, put it into a truck, take it to a landfill and bury it. It works, it's quick. You know you got it all because you can go back in and you can test the remaining soil in place. But there are disadvantages. You're creating a lot of emissions from running the trucks. You're putting those trucks onto the roads, you're wearing down the roads, you're causing traffic, you're causing more emissions all the way to the landfill, you're taking up valuable landfill space. There are better ways to do it. When it comes to groundwater, a way that we had typically treated it was to actually pull the groundwater out. You can pull it out, you run it through a filter, you remove the contaminants. Most of the time, in most places, California would be an exception, you can inject the groundwater back into the subsurface and keep pulling it out to create a loop. Works great early on, but then it kind of really starts to dissipate, doesn't work so well later on when you've got a lot of the free phase out. California, you have trouble re-injecting it, so you have to inject it into a storm sewer or sanitary sewer, provided it's clean. It's expensive, it can be time consuming, there's a number of issues with that. So we've started to look at other ways to do it. We've started to look at more of a green and sustainable approach. There are better ways to do that, technically better ways, and also more sustainable things that have less of an overall holistic impact. And that's what we're talking about. When we talk about green and sustainable remediation, we're looking for things that will be more protective of the environment. We want to clean up the site, but we want to look at the big picture. How can we minimize the environmental impact looking at the big picture, kind of the cradle to grave, if you will? Sure, I can dig it up from the site, but if I'm causing traffic and I'm causing wear and tear, and there's a potential for car accidents or whatever because I'm putting everything in, there's a potential that a truck can flip over and put contaminated soil into an environment. It causes noise, it causes a bunch of issues. That's an issue. We want to look at that big picture. And ultimately what we're trying to do is maximize, it's referred to as triple bottom line. Sure, we're trying to do the right environmental thing, but we want to look for an economic solution that makes the best use of finite economic resources, but also the social dimension. How can we create the better good and the greater good for the communities in which we're working? Here's some of the triple bottom line parameters from an environmental standpoint. What are the impacts to air, to water, to soil, to greater ecology? Financial and economic, that makes sense. How are we spending the money? What are the costs? What are the indirect costs? What are employment opportunities? How can we be flexible? How do we maintain the timing of a project? And of course, social. What is the community involvement? How can we look at communities, get people involved? How are their voices being heard? Looking at the bigger stakeholder picture. So we look for solutions that can maximize all of those. Typically when we look at the framework of how we measure this, again, we're looking for ideas that will reduce energy consumption, perhaps work in renewables. We're looking at ways to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, or at least measure those, find a way to sequester those greenhouse gas emissions if we can. And then if we can keep stuff on site, work with in situ. In situ means on site, in the ground, in place, versus having to dig it up and take it somewhere else. If we can keep it on site and minimize the potential for it being opened up and taken away, that can be quite beneficial as well. Some of the other things that we're looking for too, the use of recycled materials as opposed to fresh materials. And again, doing kind of a cost-benefit analysis of looking at all of these characters, weighing them against a number of factors and metrics to determine how we can maximize this. Maybe you can't get it all. You can't make everything a 10 out of 10, but what's that right balance where you can maximize the overall return against all of these dimensions? Any questions so far? Okay, we'll keep going.
Can I ask one?
Yes, please.
What is a free phase compound?
Oh, thank you. Okay. So think if I took some gasoline, or no, better idea, because many people here have done this. Take some vegetable oil, canola oil, corn oil, whatever, olive oil, and pour it into a glass of water. What will happen? Exactly. The oil will float on top of the water. The oil in that case is free phase. It's not aqueous phase. It's not part of the water. Now the oil, some of it will dissolve into the water. That'll be called the dissolved phase. The same thing happens if we have a release from an underground storage tank. The gasoline or the diesel oil, the diesel fuel will migrate through the subsurface. It'll hit the groundwater table, and then it'll float on the groundwater table. Some will dissolve into the groundwater to some extent. It'll be a low concentration. Majority will float. That floating part is called free phase. The dissolved phase will get in the groundwater and migrate and go places. It's a little bit tougher to capture. And presumably you're thinking about maybe the pump and treat option. When we have that floating fuel, we can take that off of the groundwater table pretty easily. But then how do we address the dissolved phase? And that can sometimes take some time. Not every compound will act that way, though. There are certain compounds, like dry cleaning solvent. This is a big issue that we're all facing. That gets into the water, it will sink. It'll go through the water column and it'll sit on the bottom. And that becomes a problem because with gasoline, you can kind of find it. You kind of know where it goes. It'll float on the groundwater table and just follow it. In the case of dry cleaning solvent, it'll sink through the water and it'll keep going. It'll keep running and running and running, and maybe it'll hit a fracture or some type of permeable soil and it gets all over the place. And trying to find it can be very difficult.
Cool, thank you.
Okay. So some of the remedial technologies that we look at, what are these specific metrics? Minimize the risk to the public. Look for something that's effective long-term and will minimize these overall impacts. Again, look at the energy inputs of how we want to do this. Again, if we can use renewable sources, great. Again, kind of strike that right balance. We mentioned earlier the use of recycled and reclaimed materials. All very important. Physical chemical treatment, where if we can break it down, that's better than just taking it out. Sometimes you can sequester material. We'll talk about that more in a moment, but if you can break it down and destroy it, there are certain compounds that you can treat them. As you treat them, they become more harmful, but eventually you get to a point where they're completely harmless. That's what we're looking to do, making sure that we can carry that all the way through so that we're not doing more harm than good. And a factor that's really important, Robert and I were talking about over here, there are a lot of things that we can do that are great, that are quite beneficial. We can't forget the time component. You want to do it quickly because you want to eliminate the risk as fast as possible. Many times you're trying to restore a piece of property to some type of beneficial reuse, and in doing so, you have to do it within some type of time constraint. That becomes very visual as well. So some of the innovative approaches that we look at, as opposed to dig it up or pump it out, are as follows. We use a technique called soil vapor extraction. This works wonderfully to remove some of these volatile compounds like gas to get into the substrate. It goes through the unsaturated zone or the Beto zone, and it'll oftentimes evaporate. And you basically apply a fancy vacuum. You drill some wells, you hook them up to a manifold, you put it onto a vacuum, and it'll actually pull the vapors out. And you can run those through a carbon filter or some other type of treatment system, and you just basically vacuum out the vapor. Works beautifully. You have to have the right soils. They have to be relatively permeable, more sandy than clays. And it only treats the unsaturated zone, does not treat groundwater. If you want to treat groundwater, you can couple it with something called air sparging. whereas the soil vapor extraction is the pull, this becomes the push. You can inject air in the subsurface below the lowest known level of contamination. You can just imagine it's like kind of like a bubble or a fish tank. Air will rise up, oftentimes it's air, sometimes people use oxygen, but air is fine. It will rise towards the subsurface. When used in conjunction with the soil vapor extraction system, you can kind of control where the air goes, and it essentially will strip the contamination out. Contaminants will migrate towards the surface, you vacuum them out, and you can treat them in the same manner. Works beautifully. Again, you want to have relatively permeable soils. The western part of San Francisco, where you have a lot of sands, this is great. The Central Valley, the San Ramon Valley, where our office is, not as great because you kind of have a lot of clays. It can be difficult out there. Chemical oxidation reduction, we're actually using chemistry to fight our battle for us. You can inject chemical reagents into the subsurface, and you'll cause a chemical reaction into the ground surface that will break down the contamination. Can work great. Oftentimes, depending on the contamination, use the right reagent, and the chemical reaction is very simple. You oftentimes will generate carbon dioxide, water, completely harmless salts. A couple disadvantages. You can sometimes create some transient chemical situations in the subsurface that can be dangerous. You want to be able to get to the contamination. That can be difficult. Sometimes trying to get to it and actually inject it and have a reaction, any type of sizable area, can be difficult. Also, there's often regulatory issues with this because you are injecting chemicals in the ground. You have to make sure that you're doing it correctly and that you're getting proper oversight. Where chemistry doesn't work, we can use biology. Many times soils will have bacteria in them that will break down the contaminants, but there's something eliminating them. Bacteria, the same thing as us. We need oxygen to live, we need oxygen, we need a food source, and by doing that we have a biochemical reaction, we need nutrients to make more of ourselves. And by doing that we can break down food. Bacteria eating benzene is the same thing as you or I eating a hamburger or chicken katsu or salad. It's the same biochemical reaction, more or less. You are using a biochemical reaction to break down that food into an energy source, utilizing oxygen in the process. You're creating side effects, byproducts, and you are also using nutrients to build into the chemical reaction so you can make more of yourself. Same thing happens. We can induce this in the environment either by creating a situation where those nutrients exist, that we add the electron acceptor, oxygen or something else. In some cases, it's a reductive reaction. We can add in something that acts as the electron acceptor. Again, this is all the kind of the chemistry 101 stuff that you either have learned or you will learn coming up at some point. But you monitor closely, make sure the reaction can take place, that everything is getting to each other. And sometimes you can actually inject bacteria into the subsurface. But by having those right reactions, by having the food source, the electron acceptor, having bacteria to do it, and having the nutrients in place so they can make more of themselves, you can have a biochemical reaction. Monitor natural attenuation. In some ways, it's a fancy way of saying let nature do its course. That's fine. You want to keep an eye on it. There are natural processes that take place in the subsurface that will break contaminants down. We mentioned that groundwater will flow. That'll sometimes take a groundwater plume and will make it more dilute so that it gets to a point where concentrations are below drinking water, or meet drinking water standards. There's oxygen in the subsurface where bacteria can sometimes do the work if the water flows and you can get to them. There are other situations where things will break down in the subsurface. So it's a matter of keeping an eye on it, making sure these things are happening. Ultimately, that's monitoring natural attenuation. Any questions? Yes?
Water product?
Water product. When we talk in terms of a chemical reaction, a great example would be dry cleaning solvent, tetrachloroethylene. Tetra for 4, chloroethylene, because we have essentially a methane molecule with chlorine on it. During a chemical reaction or a biochemical reaction, you break down the tetrachloroethylene into trichloroethylene. You've taken off chlorine atom, you put in the hydrogen atom. The idea is you start with the parent product, and during the chemical reaction, you're creating either an end or an intermediate product. That becomes the daughter. You have the parent, goes through a chemical reaction, and creates the daughter product. Anything else? Okay. So in kind of as an alternative to let's go and clean it up and make everything pristine, there are many cases where from a bigger picture of doing less harm and trying to do more good, you have situations where you might just be able to encapsulate stuff. Contamination can be difficult to get to. There can be buildings that exist. It may not pose a threat to anybody. Maybe it only poses a threat to somebody if somebody touches it. So maybe you build on it, maybe you pave it, maybe you cap it. So sometimes you can just contain material in place. You ensure that it's not going to go anywhere, that it's not going to affect the environment. You have protective measures in place such that humans and the environment will be protected by it. A great example are vapor barriers. We're talking a little bit of, okay, if you have this vapor intrusion, what do you do? Sometimes you put down some type of barrier that'll prevent the vapors from coming into the structure. That becomes a way, for some reason, you might not be able to clean it up very easily, but you can cap it, you can keep an eye on it. You also can combine it with legal controls, like deed restrictions or land use covenants that get recorded with the state government, with the various regulatory agencies that appear on the deed of title for a piece of property, so that everybody is aware of what's going on. There's all kinds of mechanisms to make sure that these are monitored long-term and that they're being controlled and that they're being protected. Robert and I, again, were talking on the way over here, we're working on a project in East Bay where there's some land use covenants that report, such that if any digging happens on the site, you have to notify DTSC, Department of Toxic Substances Control, which is one of the state regulatory agencies that monitors toxic sites. And we were going to give them a call to let them know, and the contractor notified them that they were going to notify the underground service board that they were going to dig. They notified DTSC. DTSC knew about it before we even able to give them a phone call. They called us. So these things are reported. Everyone knows about them. They're great protections. And again, that was a case of a site where it's better just to leave it in place. You can cause more harm than good by digging it up and trying to do something about it. So this, again, part of the strategy. There's, if you want to take one thing away, all these techniques can be good. There's benefit to all of them. There's never a silver bullet, so to speak. It's always finding the right technology and the approach to do the right thing. That's what we wanted to talk about in sort of the last few minutes of the presentation. From a green and sustainable approach, what are the right ways? How do we measure? How do we measure what the best thing is? So in trying to establish green sustainable remediation, we first have to look at what the boundary, how we're going to measure this. Because speaking with your instructors, it sounds like you may have talked in the last couple of weeks about life cycle assessments. Is that correct? Some discussion on that.
In one of the classes.
One of the classes.
In 10A, we will talk about it later.
Fantastic. Okay, and we'll cover a little bit too, so we'll kind of what your appetite a little bit on this. One of the things about that is a system boundary and trying to figure out exactly what we're going to measure. I had talked about the anecdote about driving in Indiana about cigarettes. One of my research colleagues, he'll do a sustainability lecture about talking about the use of coffee cups. What's a more sustainable coffee cup? A ceramic mug, a styrofoam cup, or a paper cup? We all probably have ideas, and I bet if I asked your hands would go up for everything. But it depends on how you measure it. If you go back in time and look at everything that went into the ceramic coffee cup versus the styrofoam cup, maybe, just maybe, that styrofoam cup is more sustainable. If you look at disposal and reuse, and water content and water use for cleaning, the answer may be a little bit different. So, try to come up with that right approach on the right boundary. So, where do you start? Where do you finish? The most rigorous approach would be if we started and we said, okay, we're going to look at everything about a cleanup site. We're going to look at, really the cradle to grave of everything that goes into cleaning the site, all the chemical reagents, all the motor fuels. What were the practices used in either West Texas or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela to extract the oil that was brought to a refinery to create diesel fuel? That becomes a really big picture and very complicated. You get a little bit less rigorous and you can say, okay, let's talk about some of the consumables that are brought to the site. So instead of talking about the motor fuel and the truck that brings the pipe to create the soil vapor extraction system, let's just talk about, okay, when they brought to the site, the glue. How did the glue come in here? Even less rigorous approach is we just say, okay, what's going on at the site? Let's measure what's happening at the site. What's the easiest thing? What causes the least amount of emissions? What causes the least amount of time used or cost? So trying to figure out how I measure what the rule book is, so to speak, becomes a big thing. And how do we measure it? When we're talking about energy, total energy use, percentage that might come from renewables, emissions, greenhouse gases, particulate matter, potential hazardous air pollutants, either from actually doing the work or the emissions coming off of the byproducts. Water use. What's the quantity of water? Is it recycled water? Are we getting recycled from the source? Are we bringing it in? Is it, salty, brackish water? Is it fresh water that can be used for domestic purposes? What are all these inputs that we use? Various materials too. Whether they're manufactured, are they made strictly of fresh virgin materials, or are they waste materials that may be repurposed or recycled? And then land. When it comes to land, what's the big picture? Are we looking at things that are protective of the final picture, protecting against erosion, nutrient uptake in systems? So a number of things that we want to look at and a number of ways that we can measure the efficacy. Sustainability too, we can expand that into just not kind of environmental. We talk about the cost, we can talk about safety of the workers, safety of the neighborhoods, what are employment opportunities, both direct and indirect. If you're going to have workers in the site for 5 years, not only are you looking to hire people from the community, but perhaps you have ancillary services. People will run the gas station, the coffee shops, they're going to see an uptick in business. So there are ways to measure all of this. Some of the assessment tools, some are very simple. Some of the various state agencies, such as California's DTSC, Illinois EPA, there's scorecards and matrices you can use. A couple things we'll touch on here. Various public-private initiatives that can use to come up with various semi-quantitative and quantitative methods to measure some of these, and then touch a little bit on life cycle assessments. One thing is the SRT tool. This was developed by the Air Force with some of their consulting companies that measures some of these green sustainable parameters for a variety of environmental techniques. Not only the excavation, the pump and treat that we talked about, but some of the innovative techniques where you can measure and figure out how these things affect the environment, the energy that goes into it, what are the resources that are consumed, what are the costs, what are the accident risks, not only on site but off site. And calculating all of these is the best solution that can be identified for a given site. SiteWise is developed by the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers. Similar framework that actually builds it all a little bit more, focuses again a little bit more on emissions. But again, a good way to kind of build and take a look at how these systems come together and how we can measure the efficacy of how these all work. This breaks it down kind of in a little bit of framework. You look at the remediation technique that you want to use, some of the modules and the activities that you may have, actually set up the actual monitoring the program, going ahead, starting it up, operating what needs to be done, and close up the demolition and the decommissioning the equipment, materials, transportation, equipment, how I manage the actual waste material, and then the various impacts, emissions, energy, potential health and safety to the site and people in the environment of the site, water usage. The social aspects of things too. A few years ago, myself and a couple of my colleagues, Richard's College, came up with a valuation metric for social sustainability parameters, where we've developed an Excel-based tool where we look at a whole bunch of key resources for socio-individual, institutional, economic, environmental impacts, where you can quantitatively measure these. How are all these various measures being affected by a given use, and try to identify, what remedial alternative, everything from do nothing to a very collaborative, comprehensive approach will affect the greater environment, the greater society, negatively, neutrally, or positively. Life cycle assessment. What is it? It sounds like some of you have been exposed to it, and some of you will be. Life cycle assessment is a method for looking at, very complex method, for looking at everything that goes into a product and everything that comes out of the product. How do we measure this? How do we measure all the environmental and sustainable metrics that may go into a product? It can be anything from a remediation side to the manufacture of a coffee cup or a coffee pot. And depending on the method that you apply or the software that you use, you can look at and model just about anything. If you want to incorporate the emissions that were generated at the refinery to make the plastics that go into the handle on a coffee pot, you can do that. They get very complex, you can narrow them down, but they're very powerful tools. A couple examples, SEMA Pro is a software package that's available. It's commonly used in the industry. Again, a lot of times on products, sometimes I talk in terms of engineering consulting, where we're looking at development projects. But, various corporations that manufacture products. Some of the first work was done by Coca-Cola. They're looking for a way to make a better bottle. We've lost in the Coca-Cola bottle, glass bottle. They were trying to figure out years ago if they should switch to a plastic bottle. They did some of the pioneering work in life cycle assessment to see all these impacts. So SEMA Pro is one package that takes a lot of consideration. GABI is another package. And then some of these packages factor into what's called economic input output life cycle assessment. You factor in the effect on the overall economy, local and national economies about it. So you can make it even more comprehensive and more detailed in not only what are the products and what are kind of the micro issues, but what are the macro issues from an economic basis that hold into these. Any questions? This is admittedly this is a complicated topic, and it's working on life cycle assessments is really a learn by doing. Question back there.
Does the last one specifically only talk about the economy's impact, or does it also explain potential jobs that could be created over such a process that would
It's both. It's really what do you want it to do, but the intent really is you can make it as broad as you want. It can tie into the gross domestic product of a given nation that's doing inputs or outputs. So, yeah, it really is as big as you want to be.
The social sustainability evaluation matrix that takes into account, it said semi-quantitative. I think that's an interesting balance between social and quantitative or qualitative. How do you navigate, like, how do you quantify certain social aspects?
Yeah, and it becomes, the reason why we call it semi-quantitative, it's really in the eye of the beholder and the practitioner who's doing the work, and then perhaps a reviewer or other stakeholders. If you wanted to look at the socioeconomic benefit from a project, if somebody said we're going to build a housing development here, and let's focus on the economic. Let's talk about some of the surrounding businesses. One aspect of that. It's going to create X amount of jobs, because there'll be a coffee shop or maybe a movie house or grocery store will go in. The semi-quantitative and some of that comes into, okay, do you sign, the fact that a grocery store comes in, do you sign that a 2 or a 1? Or the higher or lower number. You say, okay, it's going to be an organic grocery store, for instance, versus maybe something a little bit local. So somebody could say, well, it's going to sell a lot of processed food, and that's going to be 1 versus it's going to be an organic or vegetarian grocery store. It's going to focus on fresh produce. Maybe somebody gives that a higher score. Others say, no, it's all the same. It's it's going to become a benefit to the economy. It's going to generate taxes. So we'll sign both.
It's like a framework that doesn't necessarily. Like that's going to be up to the person.
Exactly. Yeah. The framework's in place to actually build it, but then it becomes a matter of how much weight do the practitioner wants.
Are there incentives or regulations that kind of guide companies if they're doing life cycle assessments? Do all companies do life cycle assessments?
It's a great question. Really, it depends. As far as the incentives, yes, they're out there. It depends on what the assessment, what the incentive might be. Some of you may have heard of LEED accreditation. Please forgive me. I forget what LEED stands for. I read it about 3 times a month, and I always forget what it stands for. But it's a way. It's commonly used in architecture where you're trying to achieve a green outcome. So there can be incentives there, for instance, where there can be loan programs. There might be more favorable terms where somebody may say that the architecture may lead to 10% of a greater construction cost, for instance. So we want to get a LEED gold or a LEED silver. Again, speaking of hypothetical terms, I think LEED is a wonderful thing. It depends on what you want to do. Where the incentive may be viewed, for instance, as a university may build a LEED gold building because they're going to have and operate the building for 50 to 100 years. And they're going to say, we're going to save on our air conditioning costs by doing it this way. We'll spend the extra 10% up front because we're going to save so much money on air conditioning going out. So some will look at that as being an incentive. There are, in some cases, there could be tax benefits, tax breaks if you're looking to do stuff. We live in an environment too, as the state and really more the federal government where there is, depending on what administration is in power at a given time, there may be incentives, tax breaks for the use of renewables, and then somebody else may take over and say, no, we're going to wipe this out. So there's always that. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve, but yes, those incentives can be used. And a life cycle assessment is a great way to quantify those and essentially demonstrate how you've done.
What are some of the biggest sources of contamination?
Wow. I think the easier question, what are sources that don't cause it?
I'm talking about most common issues you have.
Yeah, gas stations, dry cleaners. We always laugh in the office, off-brand gas stations, it's like guaranteed that they're going to leak. We've always laughed, they don't use storage tanks, they use hefty bags to store gas. Maybe that should be required. No, but yeah, gas stations are notorious. Dry cleaners are notorious. We have really good practices for in place because a little bit goes a long way to contaminate. A rule of thumb too, agricultural activity. The pesticides that were applied in the 1940s, the 1950s, and 1960s, many times are still going to be found in the orchards or in the farmers' fields. The pesticides, the herbicides that were applied 2 weeks ago are all gone. They've broken down because most of them are formulated to be reactive in sunlight. But before there was the knowledge to do that, these molecules were really robust. They don't break down. Anybody ever heard of PCBs? Okay, fine. PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyl. Those were developed, in the 40s and 50s. I forget exactly when they came into high use. They were used as cooling materials. They, in cutting down heavy industrial applications. They were used in, things like transformers, to keep electrical reactions under control. They were used in elevator banks and all kinds of things because they kept their properties over a wide span of temperatures, pressure. They basically, you were able to put it in there and it would run the machine for 10 years and it would never break down. The bad news was if it got out of the machine and got in the environment, it never broke down. So we still find these, and they've been banned for almost 50 years now. We still find them in sites. Now, unfortunately, they're used in small quantity because, again, they never broke down, but you do find them in things like waste oil. I don't know, Robert, what do you think? Anything else jump off the page where you see this?
I mean, I think gas station dry cleaners are probably the two jump out to me.
Yeah, just because there's so many of them.
Yeah.
It's probably the issue. Yes?
Speaking of contamination and stuff, I recall, it used to be part of the construction program. I recall at the time, they spoke upon kind of very old mechanic shop having problems, and they had problems with reopening the garages because they were so contaminated. Can you explain how you guys would manage that situation, just because all the situations that you're giving us so far look to be either open land or you break up the concrete?
Yeah.
How do you guys work when it comes to a building that has to be closed in and can't be reopened?
That's a great question. You're right. One of the things that factors into this and becomes part of the overall how do we solve the problem is what exists. What are the service conditions? If there are buildings in place, an underground storage tank, or a hydraulic lift in a mechanic's garage, the expectation is not to tear down the garage to dig it out.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can go into the building and work with it. We've done, Robert can speak of many times where he's drilled in low clearance parking garages or basements or whatever. We were trying to clean this up and taking soil borings and soil vapor extraction. You can do that. The other thing to remember too is one of the things I mentioned, you don't have to get to a pristine state. You want to get to a point where it doesn't pose a risk. Having a mechanic shop where you're going to have a competent concrete floor, you ask yourself, okay, what are the chances somebody's going to be encountering these materials? If it can evaporate and come into the into the garage, okay, then you can actually treat the floor or put systems in place that prevent vapors from coming up. If it's not volatile, it just is heavy metal or something where it's in the subsurface, and as long as you're aware of it, and again, it's recorded against the land, just don't disturb it and you're okay. That can be recorded. So essentially that works as an encapsulation. So we work very closely with the various regulatory authorities, various stakeholders in the project, just to come up with a solution. So that you come up with something that is protective, but is also allowed to use that land or that use to continue. Now, if you want to convert that garage into a daycare center, that's a different story. Then it becomes a matter of, okay, perhaps we have to get a little bit more invasive.
But what about situations such as places like Hunter's Point or Dog Factory where they close down a bunch of old school mechanic shops and revamp the area to be more residential?
Yeah.
There would be a whole assessment of going with the city and you guys essentially? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, exactly. Coming out there and making sure things are done. And of course, it's been in the news too. There have been some issues out there. And that's probably another topic for another day, maybe.
Are you going to help out with that?
If they ask, we'll do anything that anyone else to do. But again, maybe that's a topic for a law course as opposed to But no, in all seriousness, no. I mean, when things go right, and believe me, they go right far more often than things go wrong. It's working in collaboration and coming up with a quality assurance program to make sure things are done properly, that things are done in duplicate enough to demonstrate that look, these weren't, that this was done correctly, and having enough confirmation testing to showing that things are done. That's the way we all operate.
Okay, back to the gas station and the dry cleaning situation. If the way that they're making the gas station, if it leaks, do you guys implement a better system to them? And with the dry cleaning chemicals, if they're so bad, why are people still allowed to use them?
Yeah. Let's take each of those. They're each a little bit separate. So one of the reasons underground storage tanks, they used to be single wall tanks. We put in the subsurface. They wouldn't have any equipment to determine if anything, have been leaked, other than really kind of the inventory of the gas. And the idea would be, okay, I bought 100 gallons. I bought 1,000 gallons of gas last month. I sold 500, and there's only 200 left in the tank. Close enough. It's the way things used to be done. Now, people are a lot more on top of that, you know, for financial reasons, but for regulatory reasons too. Gas is a lot more expensive, and you don't want gas leaking. Right? The tanks are double walled. There's leak detection devices that are put in place. There's a number of improvements that have been brought in where, when we speak of underground storage tanks that have leaked, it's really, I mean, any tank can leak, any situation can happen. It can be overfilling when they're filling up the tanks. But the systems that are in place are just better now than they used to be. And those old systems that tended to leak where nobody really knew what was going on, they've essentially been replaced with time. You know, new technologies have been adopted. In the case of dry cleaners, there's a number of solvents that have been used that are more quote-unquote earth-friendly. Now, are they truly earth-friendly? I think they're less bad. You know, but some of them are. Some of them are using like ozone, and some are more petroleum-based versus chlorinated-based. And again, that becomes a matter of, well, okay, it's not as bad. But there's a number of improvements that have been made, and you know that tends to be an industry that's starting to get it right. So the problem is that dry cleaners are oftentimes small, independently owned shops where, you know, perhaps they're owned by a family, maybe they own two, and the regulations have been very slow to react, and it's almost been more of a political reason or an economic reason than the environmental reason. It's a great point because, yes, those dry cleaning solvents perhaps should have been outlawed a long time ago, and many parts of the world have been, and just unfortunately the United States would be slow to react for a number of complex reasons. You know, and it becomes one of those things where they're going to outlaw them, 3 or 4 years from now. I'm coming up on my 20th anniversary of 3 or 4 years from now, so, you know, hopefully we'll get there soon, but, you know, admittedly, those are pressures that, you know, that kind of fall outside of, you know, our pay grade, so to speak.
So I want to ask about the PCB again. Since you said they were already like banned, but you know how like certain transformers still exist, and is there like a push for them to be replaced? Because, like I said, if nothing's happening, you know, you just let it be, right? Yeah. But most of the time they're made of like, you know, rust, like metals that can rust and can start to have a leak.
Yeah.
But is there like a certain push for them to be replaced eventually before anything happens?
Yeah, no, great question. Utilities and operators and electrical contractors, they've been replacing these for a long time. You don't even see stickers on them anymore that say no PCBs because a lot of them have been replaced. Can I say that every transformer in California doesn't have PCBs in it? No, probably not, because a lot of these things can be well replaced, but it's really been over 40 years since then. They haven't been manufactured, they haven't been in use. The bigger question, though, becomes what happened to PCBs that were used previously? And I've talked about Mundelein, Illinois, a couple, you know, 10 miles to the east of where I grew up, the Outboard Motor Corporation. If anybody's familiar with Evinrude motors or Mercury motors for a boat, or safety people on it. But yeah, kind of the motor you put on the back of the boat and a little fishing motor, a little power boat. Well, those were invented not too far from where I grew up, and they were built. There was a huge facility that was on Lake Michigan, and they use PCBs, you know, for a number of things. In the fabrication, you know, using sharp tools and high temperatures, and so they use cooling fluids and all kinds of stuff. And in the 40s and 50s, no one really thought about it, so what they do, they dumped it in the lake, you know, and so now you got all the sediment that's related with PCBs. And so it was a huge cleanup that took years upon years to clean up. And I don't eat fish and you caught it Waukegan Harbor. You know, at some point we will, but you know, even that part of the discussion has been: is it better just to leave it in place? Because if you're going to try to pick it up, well, now you're going to stir it up. Now it kind of got out of the water column. So those are the things where you find things where you find an old waste oil tank that people poured cooling fluid into 45, 50 years ago that nobody really thought twice about, and now you found the tank and what's in it? Oh wow, just like PCBs. So you know, PCBs were in things like, you know, if you look at an old fluorescent light fixture, you know, the PCBs would be in some of the equipment in a fluorescent light fixture. So you tend to find these places. But over time, they've been, since you don't manufacture the equipment, they haven't been able to be used for 40 years. They tend to get eliminated because that gets replaced.
Because you work so closely with the polluter, is there ever a time where you feel conflicted, like you you might wind up making the bad guy look like less of a bad guy because of the work you do?
Amazing question. Fortunately, we don't work too much with the polluter. We tend to work with people that want to buy the site. And you know, it's funny. 2020, you know, I've been in the industry about 20 years now. When I started, you tended to have, there was a little bit of the mentality of, oh, this stuff's all overkill. Hey, you know, I used to wash hands and gasoline when I was a kid and all this. And this really changed. I think our client base is a little bit different. You know, I think as people become more aware and more sophisticated, you don't see that mentality too much. Also, we work with a lot of stakeholders in projects. We work with the developers coming in and trying to clean something up, but they want to do that too because you know they want to turn around, sure, they want to make a profit, but they want to do something right. They're seeing the abandoned gas station, they want to turn it into whatever shopping center or homes, and they want to do something right by the community, and they want to make money doing it. But we're working with you know either local or state government that's overseeing it to make sure it's done correctly, and you know our interests are aligned. We may sometimes disagree about okay, what is what's the right approach, but we tend to negotiate it out. You know, large petroleum companies too. You know, there are people in those companies that are involved on the environmental cleanup side. There are people that probably don't like that approach. Speak for myself personally, I get to work on projects, and most environmental consultants with whom I work in the Bay Area, our interests are aligned between regulator, you know, clients, and consultants. In other industries, I presume somehow they come to some type of peace with that. You know, I'm not sure how a big chemical company, you know, I'm not in any way, you know, saying anything that, you know, Monsanto, let's talk about I've known people who've worked at Monsanto over the years. Again, there are environmental consultants that work for Monsanto. I don't want to speak for those consultants, but, you know, I've got to think there are enough people at Monsanto that want to do things the right way and want to clean things up. But, you know, we all hear about Roundup and some of the issues with some of the active ingredients in Roundup, you know, for killing weeds and stuff. And yeah, it's a great question. I'm afraid I'm not answering your question probably the way you want to hear it, but you know, I think in my scope, I'm fortunate that I am in a position where I'm aligned with all the stakeholders, and we come to some type of consensus. Presumably, that takes place with other consultants.
So I understand that you're an environmental engineer and your colleague is an environmental scientist. So how does their role differ on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for Robert. Maybe Robert can help. I'm up here. It's I think I was kind of good with my slides. I had a quick little case study, but we can. It's a will of the class to skip that. It was 3 slides talking about a site.
Questions are going well.
Yeah, let's take questions. I'm perfectly fine. Maybe offline after class we can talk about that. So yeah, Robert, your perspective on that. I think my perspective is just kind of we do something, work on the same projects. I think we bring it to the concept.
Yeah, I mean, I think I get out in the field a lot more at this stage in my career, not making all the extreme decisions that Jeff makes, but yeah, I get dirty, get on the ground, and have a nice split between working on reports, you know, analyzing the data that from the sampling we conducted, but also getting to conduct the sampling, see the sites, and see, you know, firsthand how they're progressing or how they're impacted.
There are some subtleties with kind of state law, how it manages the professions, and some things, to use the vernacular, just have to be stamped by an engineer, have to be stamped by a geologist. And that becomes kind of subtle about, you know, perhaps, you know, some of the inputs and some of the remedies that may be made. Maybe it's like, well, this is kind of an engineer has to design this. There are some things with that.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I mean, we work hand in hand on the project.
Probably 90% of what we do is
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you guys was cleaning up a site and if something goes wrong, so where it poses like a huge health risk to the community or something, what are the procedures to keep the community safe? And do you guys work together on that, or is that something out of your head and somebody else involved with that?
Yeah, no, if our names are on the reports, they're gonna come looking for us. So we're involved. It's a great question too, because typically with a project, if anything you know, we're gonna put together a health and safety plan. We're gonna put together, a sampling plan. There's gonna be a number of plans that are developed for a site that have a lot of protocols, kind of what if protocols. And they range, a typical health and safety plan will range for everything from what happens if somebody on the site gets bitten by a snake to, okay, a truck flips over, what do we do? Who do we call? And so, we're in constant communication with what's going on. There's a specific protocol of, okay, something happened. Here's what we do. In doing those, and again, the site of note is going to have, like I said, a local or a state agency, sometimes federal government. We do work with the U.S. as well. And there's all kinds of notification requirements in place. So, like anything else, okay, what happened? First thing you do is say, okay, everyone take a deep breath. What happened? Let's figure this out. And what are the procedures? And we go through those procedures, you notify everybody, and you figure out how to fix it, how to take care of it, and you take it from there. And again, it could be anything. When the truck flips over on the street, it's like, okay, let's okay. How's the driver? Okay, driver's okay. What fell out of the truck? Okay. Is it liquid? Is it going to flow? Okay, how do we stop it from getting in the sewer? If it's soil, okay, let's cover it, let's clean it up. Everything kind of has a procedure behind it.
If you guys,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. If you guys were doing something like one of the, I think you mentioned it as like credit to grade, when you just going to dig up the chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
So if something was like that, and just say the chemicals that you was cleaning up got airborne,
Mm-hmm.
How do you guys handle that type of procedure?
Yeah, we do on many of our projects too. We'll have a dust control plan, and before you do the cleanup, you characterize it to know what you're dealing with. And chemicals may have a long-term exposure, whereas if it got airborne, okay, what are the concentrations that are being airborne, and how do you mitigate the dust, and how do you prevent that from being airborne? So it's a matter of what's there, how do we control it? It could be as simple as, we're going to keep it sprayed down with water to minimize dust generation, all the way to, we're going to use all kinds of chemical suppressants. We're going to have monitors set up, upwind, downwind, and see what the exposures are. There are some projects that Robert and I have worked on where we have real time, if not 24/7 monitoring, but from start to stop of every day, where there are exceedances or differential exceedances or alarms that are sounding. If so, here's what you do. So depending on what you have, you have protocols in place to make sure that things are safe. Not only for the workers, but the
Yeah, and if there's a volatile compound that we're worried about while excavating, there's been several times where we will conduct ambient air sampling, have maybe an excavator go dig in the area that will eventually be excavated and off-hauled. And they'll dig trenches and we'll set out ambient air monitor or sample canisters. And we will analyze those just to get a feel for if workers on site or the general public near the site, if there's a potential that they could be exposed in the remediation process.
Yeah. A lot of times we do it too, not because somebody's telling us to do it, but many of our clients they want to do. Both because they want to do right, but also because they may have a project that's controversial. The neighbors don't want something built. The strangest things come up. We have a site right now where there are neighbors that are upset that a daycare center is going to go. So they're trying to find this thing, and you're like, okay, so everybody has something. And so that's the case when they finally go into construction. We're going to be doing air monitoring, not because somebody wants to, but the first day something starts, you're going to have one of those people on the phone with the police saying, "Oh my goodness, the dust is everywhere," and we're going to have a record show. No, we're just monitoring it. It's fine. So.
Do you ever have to deal with nuclear materials? I'm thinking of just media, but like Treasure Island.
Yeah, it's funny. We're working on Treasure Island, but on geotech, on environmental. I personally haven't had to. The only nuclear I've ever had to do, a couple times I've gone in to doctors' offices where they're doing radiation treatment, just to kind of go in and do wipe tests just to make sure that all the equipment is taken out correctly. But it is a big aspect of it. Department of Defense sites like Treasure Island, Hunters Point. It's sometimes manufacturing, but it's on.
Quick question about your backgrounds and how did you get to where you are today? And what fields do you see as being relevant to this kind of work you do?
Yeah, well, you saw my baseball career is not going to work out. But I fell in the category of knowing what I wanted to do since I was 5 years old. I didn't know what it was called, but I liked building things with Legos. My parents got me a Lego set for Christmas, and I just thought this is the greatest thing in the world. And that evolved into architecture, and then eventually evolved into structural engineering as well. And so, many civil engineers, the field I went into, I was about structural, and focused on that as an undergrad and loved it. And wanted to go to graduate school, and this is the case of many people in civil engineering, be it water resources, environmental, geotechnical. Went to graduate school and found out that I really, in graduate school, enjoyed the geoenvironmental work more, and I kind of evolved into that. Now, I kind of tongue-in-cheek laughed about that, but I grew up on a farm. My formative years, I kind of laughed. I was born in the suburbs, moved to a farm, and then lived in Chicago for several years. So, it's like one of those things whenever somebody's like, well, I grew up in the city, or I grew up in the country, or I grew up in the suburbs. Yeah, I understand. I know it all. But growing up on a farm is a great experience because you really became at least aware of the environment. And in the Midwest, you truly had 4 seasons. And you truly had, the fallow time and the crop raising time. I mean, it was maybe a few more seasons or whatever. But unwillingly or unknowingly, I became interested in the environment, just kind of protecting things and seeing kind of cause and effect. And, that just gave me an appreciation. I think when I got to graduate school, my eyes were opened up. I really walked to that person. Robert, how about you?
I was raised by sort of hippies in the redwoods. So I've always loved nature, been around it, grew up in it. So I knew, when I was pretty young, that I wanted to be involved in some sort of science, restoration, conservation work that just, valuing the environment. And I think, early on in school, like elementary and then beyond, and just right away, just clicked with it, loved science, and just kept pursuing it.
So you pursued environmental science as your undergraduate studies?
Yeah, actually, my undergrad was marine and coastal ecology, and just through meeting people and found a job with ENGEO almost 12 years ago now. And started out in the field, less in the position I have now, and just kind of worked out and kept learning more and managed to get more.
Just with housekeeping too, we're always looking for field interns.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Leave behind documents.
Yeah.
And to your point, the piece of advice I would give to everybody really quickly is, we're not just trying to sound humble, but if I can do it, anybody can do it. STEM is it hard? Yes. Is it difficult? No. It's just hard work. Just putting your mind to it. And I remember when I was junior, everyone, oh my goodness, algebra 2 and trigonometry is so hard. Oh, I kind of got into it. This is kind of fun. And I took it as a challenge. Just work hard. And it'll all happen out. And, it's like everything else. If you talk to attorneys, or you talk to engineers, or you talk to doctors, or whatever, it's hey, if it's worth it, it's hard to get there. But it's hard. Put in the hard work.
We have a question here.
Oh, yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
You're mentioning a lot of safety protocols that you're familiar with, or at least practice. So just in future thinking and planning, I'm not sure how many people here would be interested in environmental remediation, but just what kinds of certifications and training, like hazardous waste operations and stuff of that sort, would or have you taken that you recommend or that you know of that could make us more competitive for this job market right now?
Yeah, there's a number of things. You mentioned hazardous waste operations, HAZWOP. That's essentially it's an OSHA requirement just to be aware. There's different levels of training. Both Robert and I are HAZWOP trained. That's always a good one too. And that's a great one too, because if you're interested in engineering, if you're interested in environmental engineering or anything in earth sciences, if you're getting interviewed and say, look, I'm HAZWOP trained, that kind of should perk people's ears up on, wow, this person either was aware of this or is on the ball, or that moves the needle. But then anything else, really, we talked a little bit about, I was talking to Peggy earlier, about, the business of sustainability, and you'll learn a little more life cycle assessments. Large multinational companies have people that do life cycle assessments of their companies. And there's a number of accreditations in learning how to do that in software. There's EPA has something called ENVISION, which is a sustainability and resiliency for infrastructure. There's certifications in that. We talked about LEED certified. That's also so. Yeah, it becomes a Google search. There's a number of things out there you can do. And it's good to do that Google search too, because I think it makes you aware and it gives you the ability in job interviews, or if you're looking for something. You say, look, I'm aware of the lingo and some of these trainings that we can do. Some of the trainings are expensive, but at least if you're aware of them, there are very cost-effective good things you can do too. So, yourself a group.
What are the biggest challenges that you guys overcame that led you to the successful career that you are at now?
Easier question is, what are the strengths I was able to apply? Oh, wow. I've got a couple. I was a good student. Math was always, frankly, I don't say it was my more. It was the one I had to work in most, and that's why math always intrigued me. I took like the ACT or the SAT. It was like, oh look, go be an English professor. Math was fun because it was something that I had to work at, and that was good. But then also, I talked a little bit about the naysayers. I talked about alpha too. It's not that I was in a bad environment with friends or parents that were trying to talk me out of stuff, but it was overcoming some of the negatives that you would like, oh my goodness, you're going to do physics. Physics is so hard. I kind of like it, I kind of enjoy it. It's if not intuitive, it's fun to me. So it was one of the challenges of just experiencing things myself and getting through, and just like everybody else in this room, that the fact that you're in this room means you've overcome something. Everybody has challenges in their life, and overcoming those challenges and showing and believing in yourself. That's the biggest thing. I think that was the thing, just getting to the point where I can believe in demonstrable proof that I was learning and overcoming those challenges.
Was there one point that you felt like you couldn't do it?
When I was in graduate school, anybody ever see the movie Apollo 13? Okay, you remember the opening scene when they talked about Apollo 1? They're having the whole benefit or the whole issue with Apollo 1 was they're trying to figure this thing out, and they're trying to keep the government interested. They put 3 early astronauts into Apollo 1, and they're trying to test some equipment out, and there's a fire, and all three of the astronauts passed away. When I was in graduate school, I was working on a new apparatus, and I had done some 2D physical modeling, and that worked pretty well. I was going to try to do 3D, or as I like to call it, 2.5D. And so we built this much bigger model, this much bigger bench model. And I was having trouble with the apparatus, and it literally blew up on me in the lab. And I got covered in soil, and I'm trying not to make it sound dramatic, but it was plexiglass, so it's not like shattered glass. It was sharp, there was plexiglass everywhere. There's sand and there's water, and I'm just kind of sitting there on Saturday. Great, what am I going to do? And so I kind of left and kind of picked up the broken remains of the apparatus, put it on the shelf, cleaned it up, went home, got an ice cream cone, sat on my couch, looked out the window, and thought, all right, what am I going to do better? And kind of started going to work. Then called my professor, because the old story's coming, I broke it, I bought it, so I don't want to figure it out. But that was that was like a 45 minutes of just trying to figure it out and going, okay, how's this going to work out? Where does this go? And you have those 5 minutes of doubt, but then it was one of these things where you stop and go, okay, how do we make this happen? That's engineering. That's engineering.
Same question.
I'm not going to lie. I feel like I've been pretty fortunate in my journey thus far. So I had a good experience through school and managed to kind of, through networking, had a good friend in school, stumbled into this career with ENGEO, and kind of the rest of history. It's been an amazing journey so far. So
I have one more too. It was my first exam in college. It was chemistry. Essentially chemistry 1 was the first inorganic chemistry that virtually everybody on campus has to take. And the first midterm I got a 47. Like, oh great, okay. What do I do now? And you know, what did I do? I went home and I studied. And I got a 92 on the final. I don't get an A from the course. And that was a great class too, because you know some of those labs last 3 hours. You're with everybody's taking this, so it's a great way to meet people and just kind of, you know, people from different backgrounds. Again, I was coming from a farm, and there were kids from literally all over the state of Illinois, and you know, beyond the state of Illinois, from different backgrounds, and that was fun. International students, and people from the city, and people from the suburbs, and it just was. There we were waiting for a reaction to take place for 2 hours, and we just had time to stop and chat. And so that 47 made me feel very lonely and very small, but those experiences in the lab were very big. Because you got to know people. It's like, I do belong.
It sort of reinforces a message I've been trying to say, which is, and Landis says this too, is like, build your academic community, because that academic community will, you know, pay off in the long run, assuming that, you know, you're a key contributor to that community and people respect your contribution. But, you know, that hearing that Robert was able to get his first job through that academic community and somebody who trusted in his skill set enough to say, hey, my colleagues at NGO, I know this guy who might be a good fit here. You know, that's so important to you. So, you know, getting good grades is important, but that kind of thing is also key to success.
Yeah, I went to business school, and one of the things at the University of Washington MBA program, one of the things that told us was that your school, view it as a three-legged stool. It's the academics, but it's also kind of the professional development, going out and meeting people in the roles that you want to do. You know, if you want to go be a banker, go talk to bankers. But then also the social development of your colleagues, learn them, because they're going to be lifelong.
Tying back to connections and employment, I want to ask about employment opportunities. How high in demand would the environmental engineering field be for potential applicants? Basically, how's the job market?
Yeah, come see what's on my inbox waiting for me to address. Here's how you know.
It's growing.
Yeah, it's growing. Yeah, for 2 reasons. Number one, I mean, if even if the world is becoming a little bit more aware, and even if pollution, for instance, is going down, population is going down. So pollution per capita is going down. The mere amount of people is going down. So things are taking place. And regulations, I mean, are getting more and more stringent. So it's a long-winded way of saying that I think this job is going to be demand, you know, well after we're all gone. So yeah, long term, I think it's a great future. It's necessary, and it's not only that, but it's at the forefront of everybody's mind. Yeah, and then we have, you know, we were talking about climate change 20 years ago. And now we're talking about climate change every day.
Well, in particular in the Bay Area, there's no, or very little, just clean, untouched land to develop, right? So a lot of it is trying to get creative on land that's no longer being used, that was industrial or commercial use in the past, that previously has not been worth any developer's investment to, you know, make another use out of. Now it's worth it, and now it needs to be cleaned up to do so.
Yeah, but I mean, it's all of that too. If you go a step further, if you look at, you know, large energy companies, the Chevrons, the Exxon Mobils of the world. I mean, eventually, one way or another, we're going to get away from fossil fuels. Presuming those companies are smart, they should be at the forefront of renewables. You know, why wouldn't they be? You know, the commercial sector energy companies, that's great. I believe they are. Now, how do we make that happen? How do we improve upon that? So there's a lot of that goes on.
Does NGO have internships?
We do.
for
We
college
do.
students?
I mentioned earlier, so we'll have some lead lines and we'll be sticking around afterwards. So, yeah, if you just want to grab something, give us a call, please. Summer's coming. We're always looking for people.
Could you specify one more time some of the certifications that you're looking for, whether it be intern or job? What?
Yeah, sure. Lead, you know, and again, I'm kind of going off the top of my head, lead certification. HAZWOPER, it's HAZWOPER. I would say there's a number of life cycle assessment software applications, such as STEMA Pro or Envision. If you're having a familiarity or a certification in those, would be some. I'm sorry?
Confined space?
Oh, yeah, that ties in with the HAZWOPER training, so that's always good. You know, in NGO specific to us, we do a lot of earthwork construction, testing and observation. So there's certification or there's some regulatory stuff with the gauges that they're called nuclear gauges. They have a small nuclear, so they're a microwave oven. So being nuclear gauge certified is a good thing.
There's some like visual emissions evaluation certifications we get through Cal EPA and US EPA for stationary source emissions, like smokestacks and whatnot.
Yeah, so you're kind of looking at diesel equipment, CPR, being CPR trained.
Do you guys have your PE, and how long did it, not how long, was it challenging for you to pass it the first time?
Yeah. Me being the engineer, I do have my PE. I did pass it the first time in 2005. I spent a lot of time, knowing that the PE and having talked to people that had struggled in passing it or whatever, I made the kind of commitment that summer, to be like the nerdy kid in the library all summer while everybody else was offline. I was every Saturday in the library studying. So honestly, I put so much time and effort into it. I didn't think the test was terribly challenging. But again, that was just a crazy function of all the time investment I had made. There were review courses that go into it too, so I've taken all the review courses. So yeah, I put a lot of investment into it. It's like everything else. It's like if you put the effort in, that will won't necessarily make it easy, but it'll make it.
What about you?
I don't have my PE. That's something on my list, but I haven't quite checked that off yet.
So you said it's something on your list, so you plan on getting it, and do you think that it'll be more challenging for you now than if you would have got it early on into your career?
Well, if you go for your PE, because you don't have an engineering degree, you can get a PE without having an engineering degree, but you have to acquire a number of years of work experience.
Right. So I think at this point, I have those, potentially have that experience, or I'm coming up to it. So I'm sure it would have been easier when I was younger and like in the thick of schooling all the time. I haven't been to a course required, sitting in a classroom setting. So test taking, I'll need to get back up to speed.
Yeah. But on the road to a PE is what they call, depending on where you are, the EIT, the engineering training, or the FE, fundamentals of engineering test, which is kind of like a free test. And I think you can take that any time. And I waited a long time to take that. I think it definitely would have been easier when I was a student, just because everything would have been longer, you seem fresh. Yeah. The stuff I had used every day was pretty straightforward. But when I'm being asked, questions about electrical circuits and thermodynamics, which I hadn't done in 10 years. Okay, next section.
I just want to be sensitive to the time. It is 3. Why don't we thank our guests and. If you guys have a few moments, if anyone has questions, you're free to come down. And Peggy, do you want to say anything about SUS 5 for your students?
Have a great break.
Yeah. 10 A, have a great break. Look on Canvas. I will be updating it today for stuff due after.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your break. Yeah. It's Friday. Get out of here.